Story 1. Back in the 1980s, I was on one of the first flights of the U.S. Marshall's Prisoner Air Transport Service, which inspired the movie Con Air. It wasn't as bad as the film, but it was still not a very nice way to fly. Story 2. I was flying in at night when our plane was struck by lightning twice during descent, causing sparks to light up outside our windows. We had to circle back twice to restart the descent. I was sitting next to an airline employee, and he remarked, "Oh, that's not good." We landed safely and were fine. Story 3. Landed in Phoenix during a severe dust and windstorm. The first landing attempt was a go-around at the last second. The flight attendants looked particularly anxious, and the plane was making side-to-side movements I had never experienced before or since. The worst part was that once we landed, we were only on the ground for about 20 minutes, and I was continuing on the same flight, so I couldn't get off the plane to regain my composure. We went straight back up into a thunderstorm right after. The lady who took the seat next to me on the continuing leg noticed that I was not feeling well and kept me distracted with conversation during takeoff. I asked her if she was a therapist or a psychologist, and she replied, "Oh no, nothing like that. Do you know about Dianetics?" Suddenly, I longed to be back on the first leg of the flight in the storm. The next 2 hours were incredibly long. Story 4. I was on a flight from Beijing to New York City in business class. It was very turbulent, and when they finally removed the fasten seatbelt sign, people lined up to go to the bathrooms between business and coach. It got turbulent again, and an older woman lost her balance and fell into a man's lap sitting in the bulkhead seat in coach. Just then, she had an accident all over him. The odor was unbearable. They tried to clean it up, but it was everywhere, on him, the chair, and the floor. Story 5. I'm not trying to sound mean, just honest. A man next to me was obese, taking up half of my seat, which I don't think is fair. I really dislike when people touch me. It was an 11-hour plane ride with me trying my hardest to avoid being touched by someone in my space, and I cramped up so badly that I had to take pain relief medication. It was the worst flight ever. I silently cried the whole time, as I was already feeling sad, but that was the breaking point. I felt bad for him because I'm sure he doesn't like being in the way, but I cannot have people touching me. Story 6. Other than a few flights that experienced a lot of turbulence, the worst incident involved an elderly man who wanted to be upgraded to business class without paying. As I was getting to my seat, he was yelling, "But I have a cane," while his son was trying to explain that he would be kicked off the flight if he didn't calm down. He eventually settled down, and we started taxiing for takeoff. However, as the flight attendant was going over the safety procedures, he attempted to trip her with his cane. She warned him to stop or we would have to return to the terminal. He seemed to calm down again, and then we prepared for takeoff. The elderly man unbuckled his seatbelt and started making his way to business class at an angle of over 45 degrees. Everyone began ringing the call button. He lost control, and we had to return to Atlanta to remove him from the flight. I just wanted to go home. Story 7. Worst and best in one trip. Flying from Los Angeles to Fort Lauderdale on Virgin. I am overweight. I am the person that no one wants to sit next to, and I understand. I try not to fly if I don't have to and plan for times when the plane might not be as full. I ask for empty seats next to me when possible. I apologize, but I cannot afford first class or to buy 2 seats. I always choose aisle seats so I can lean out as much as possible. I do everything I can to accommodate the other person because I understand. It is extremely painful for me when I have to fly somewhere. Most people don't say anything. Some mutter under their breath or act disgusted. Even when I am not really over the armrest, I am often jammed hard against the other armrest, leaving me with bruises afterward. Once, a woman noticed how uncomfortable I was and said, "Oh my, sweetheart, you look miserable. Relax a little," raising the armrest between us. She told me her dad was a big guy too, so she understood. The story of my flight on Virgin. It was my return after getting fired from my job there. It was a difficult situation, and I was already feeling miserable. The woman in the middle seat started complaining immediately, getting louder until the flight attendant had to come over to see what the commotion was about. I was mortified and tearing up. At the time, I was a 48-year-old man. So the more she complained, the more upset I became, and the more inconsolable she grew. She told the flight attendant that if they couldn't move me, they needed to remove me from the plane, as I was clearly too large to fly. This was the worst experience of my life. The flight attendant looked at me and the woman, saying, "Excuse me for just a moment. Let me see what I can do." I envisioned being asked to leave the plane and desperately trying to figure out what to do next. The flight attendant returned with a smile on her face. "Excuse me, sir, but I found you another seat. Please accept my apologies for the inconvenience." She led me to my seat in first class. I sat next to Helio Castroneves, an IndyCar driver, and his family. It was the best flight ever. After landing, I made sure to stay in my seat and waited for the woman to pass by. I grinned from ear to ear as she went by. Story 8. I was on a short 1-hour flight in a twin-engine commuter jet. About 20 seconds after takeoff, as we were accelerating to cruising speed and altitude, we lost both engines. It was surreal to have a plane going from full throttle to nothing but the wind whistling by. The pilot quickly restarted one of the engines, but at that point, the plane had to circle back and land. This took about half an hour, and they had to cut every non-essential system to keep the plane running, which made it really hot really quickly. I was seated up front, and as we were coming in for the approach, I could hear the warning system go boop boop stall stall, since the pilot was struggling to maintain airspeed for the landing. The worst part was that one of the flight attendants was still in training and became overwhelmed. The others had to move her to the front cabin to help calm her down and prevent her from panicking the other passengers. We landed back at the departure airport, but it had already closed for the night. It took hours to get another crew and plane up and running. Story 9. On an international flight from Italy to the United States, the flight was delayed due to poor planning rather than weather. We did not find out until the morning of our departure that it was leaving several hours later, so we woke up very early for no reason. This turned our trip into an almost 24-hour ordeal. Once on the plane, we sat in the summer heat for a solid hour, and it was incredibly uncomfortable. Everyone was sweating and miserable. As we approached the United States hub, our connecting flight was leaving. We live only 2.5 hours away, so we arranged for a friend to pick us up instead of trying to book a later connecting flight. Customer service informed us that this was acceptable and that they would reimburse us for the missed connecting flight. All we requested from the airline was compensation for the portion of the flight we could not take. They offered us $25 each for a flight that costs between $125 and $150, which was insulting. This situation made me consider my rights. Since we departed from Italy, our flight was governed by European Union regulations, which meant we were entitled to much larger compensation. By extremely lowballing us, we ultimately received a much larger refund than we anticipated. The plane ride was awful, but the refund was amazing. Story 10. The person in front of me had a colostomy bag that was leaking. I almost called the attendant to request my air mask be provided. Story 11. Probably the time my plane got struck by lightning just as we pulled away from the jetway. We weren't airborne yet. It fried the electronics. We had to sit on the aircraft until the airline decided what to do with us. We were stuck on the plane for about 90 minutes with no air conditioning, no lights, and the only communication was the flight staff speaking loudly. Eventually, they got us all off and rebooked, but by that time we had missed connecting flights at our next destination. Nothing harrowing, just really inconvenient. Story 12. I went skydiving one weekend with my friends. As I was getting set up in the door to prepare for the jump, my foot slipped, and I fell on my back, bouncing out of the plane early. It messed up the entire skydive, and the incident was captured on camera. The video was played repeatedly once we got to the ground for everyone to see. Story 13. After my father's funeral, I endured a 10-hour flight alone while suffering from severe diarrhea. I was sweating and crying. Upon arriving back, customs treated me like a drug dealer until I finally broke down in tears. Story 14. Flying into Berlin on a replacement aircraft because our original plane had a technical fault. There was a thunderstorm directly over Tegel, so the pilot said we would fly around for it to clear. He clicked off and then immediately came back on to say we had to land because we were running out of fuel. We could not land at Tegel, so we flew to a military airbase near Berlin. It was a very rough and steep ride down. The aircraft was rattling, with lots of turbulence and air pockets. Many passengers were screaming and children were crying. We landed without any issues, but several passengers wanted to get off as they did not want to take off again. They were told by the captain that there were no steps, so they would have to jump out the door, risking injury, and that once on the ground, they might be shot by the military tank that had pulled up beside us. Eventually, a refueling truck arrived and filled us up. The captain paid with his credit card, and before we knew it, we were back in the air heading for Tegel. It was probably the worst and best British Airways flight I had experienced. The incident actually cured my fear of flying, as I really enjoyed the experience of what felt like real flying by the crew to get us to the ground as soon as possible. Story 15. I have flown many times throughout my life and have never felt nauseated on a plane except for one occasion. It was a small propeller plane hopping from an island to the mainland on a stormy night. We were tossed around in every direction, going up and down frequently. My mother looked across the aisle at me and pretended to be sick, and I suddenly realized that I agreed with her feeling of queasiness. Finally, we landed, and my mom mentioned that she had looked out the front windshield and saw that we had essentially landed sideways, as if in a skid. That was quite unpleasant, but I have to give credit to the pilots, as we made it safely. Story 16. 18 hours from Singapore to London, via New Delhi, in 1987. A child with learning difficulties constantly kicked the back of my seat throughout the entire flight, accompanied by tics and outbursts. He couldn't help it, but it was my worst experience. Story 17. I'm slightly claustrophobic. I dislike small planes where I can't even stand up. I also need to move and stretch frequently. I had a 2-hour flight on a small plane that was packed, and the seats were crammed tightly together. Being a tall, skinny guy at 6 feet 4 inches, I couldn't sit comfortably with my legs in front of me. They were locked against the seats ahead. I was in a middle seat with 2 large people on either side of me. I found I couldn't move at all. I couldn't even use the armrests because the passengers beside me were also crammed into their seats. I don't rely on this skill often, but in high school, I had a religion class where I learned how to meditate. I entered a full meditation mode for that entire flight because the alternative was panicking and feeling like I was buried alive. Story 18. Sitting next to someone who needed 2 seats but bought one needs to be addressed, as this occurs frequently. Carry-on luggage should be measured. Story 19. In my work, I used to fly frequently but can say I have had very few bad experiences or cancellations. However, I did have one incident flying into Halifax, Nova Scotia, in a blizzard on a private company jet. It took 2 attempts and was absolutely terrifying. I thought we were goners. 2 years ago, I flew through Dublin, and it required stairs to deplane. Since I am now disabled, after a long delay, they brought a sky crane contraption to assist me. Unfortunately, the device jammed, and I was stuck in the air in the rain for half an hour while they tried to fix it. The 2 cheerful Irish mechanics found it amusing, but I, feeling like a downed rat, did not share their humor. I also missed my connecting flight. Thank you, Ryanair. Story 20. I sat next to a child around 4 years old, whose parents were seated 2 rows in front by the door, leaving no seats in front of them. The parents had paid for extra legroom for themselves, but not for their child, so the seat was randomly allocated. I had fun with the child, but it was a 4-hour flight, which was quite exhausting and not at all what I had expected. Story 21. Flew from Dallas to Seoul. I was right behind 2 crying babies who cried every 30 minutes. It was a rough flight for sure. Story 22. I was an agent trying to escort a witness to a hearing, and would you believe it? There were snakes on that plane. Story 23. Getting a migraine while boarding and then having a baby start crying across the aisle from me. I don't dislike the baby. It's just a difficult situation. Story 24. A passenger boarded the plane with wine purchased at the airport, proceeded to drink it before takeoff, and spilled half on his shirt. The pilot made the decision to remove him, which took an hour of waiting for the police to escort him off and for his luggage to be removed from the hold. It was not an ideal way to start a 12-hour flight. Additionally, it seems the seats are getting smaller each year in economy class, and passengers appear to be more miserable flying than they were 10 to 20 years ago. Story 25. Flying from Atlanta to Huntsville, Alabama, on a Dash 8 propeller-driven aircraft through a severe thunderstorm was quite an experience. Roller coasters have nothing on that. Story 26. On a 5-hour flight with a party of 4, 2 of us had to sit separately, so I sat towards the front. I had the window seat with 3 seats across. I had taken my medication since I tend to get motion sickness from air, car, and sea travel. A nice lady was seated beside me with her husband, while her parents were on the other side of the plane. As we were descending, I felt nauseous and told the lady that I thought I was going to be sick. I had one sick bag and turned as best as I could toward the window to use it. After filling it up, I folded the top down, but I realized I needed another bag. The parents passed another bag down to me. All this time, the plane was landing and I filled another bag. What was strange was that the lady took the bag from me and passed it to her father, who she said was a doctor. I felt so embarrassed that I didn't want to get off the plane. Story 27. In February, I took a trip to Las Vegas. The person behind me was coughing loudly and never covered his mouth. 3 days later, I was in bed for a week with COVID. Story 28. Flying from Colorado to Maine after being discharged from a severe medical alcohol detoxification. During a layover, we waited for an hour and a half while boarded, only to find out that the pilot had timed out. We had to disembark until they found another pilot. Once that pilot was found, we reboard. Then the icing event started. Story 29. I had an early morning flight to Benidorm but arrived at the airport at 1 a.m. due to poor public transport. I tried to nap in the terminal but failed. Eventually, I boarded the plane and was able to catch some sleep. When I woke up, it felt as though I couldn't breathe. I began to panic but managed to calm down before needing to call for oxygen. That was strange. Story 30. I have 2 experiences to share. Once, I was flying into Rhode Island on a small plane and unfortunately found myself stuck between 2 very large men, each over 300 pounds. I'm a bit chubby too, but I'm short and definitely not that big, so they both squished me. The second experience was on a flight to India. I was in business class on Emirates, and the man sitting next to me farted the entire trip, even laying down to point his backside toward me. It was quite unpleasant, and he really needs to see a doctor. Story 31. On a whim, I bought myself a non-stop red-eye flight from San Francisco International Airport to Paris. I didn't have a lot of money, so I went with the cheapest option available. I sat in the middle of a 5-seat row at the very back of the plane. The seats in that row did not recline. To make matters worse, I was sandwiched between 2 very large people. The icing on the cake was the little dog on the plane that kept barking randomly. Needless to say, I got no sleep on that flight. I learned my lesson. You get what you pay for. Story 32. The plane was on the tarmac, and we all boarded, but it was delayed for almost 4 hours. I still have no idea why, but they wouldn't let us off. There were 3 babies on board, screaming pretty much the entire time. It was rough. Story 33. I had a red-eye flight from Alaska to Denver, and I have never been able to sleep on planes. I received a Valium from my doctor before the trip. I took the pill 30 minutes before the flight, and it made me very sick. I managed to refrain from vomiting, but it was close. I was pale, shivering, and drenched in sweat. I have never tried that again. Story 34. Spirit Airlines, for both the flight there and the flight back, was quite an experience. I had strep throat the whole time, but I was 12, so my parents made me go on vacation anyway. On the flight there, a man had to be forcibly escorted off by police, literally kicking and screaming because he was refusing to wear a mask. This caused our flight to be delayed by almost 40 minutes. There was a ridiculous amount of turbulence, and the strep throat completely destroyed my stomach. The airport was so small that the only way off the plane was these massive, very fragile, unstable stairs. On the flight back, there was a baby screaming at the top of its lungs. It wasn't even crying, just constant shrieking. Its mom wasn't even trying to do anything. She just sat there with headphones while it screamed for 6 straight hours. Then I got diarrhea from being on antibiotics for over a week, and I found myself in the plane bathroom. With the turbulence, it was loud, and when someone else needed to use the bathroom, I was yelling, "Someone's in here!" as loudly as someone with strep can yell. They either didn't hear me or didn't care and tried to force the door open. Eventually, they got a flight attendant to unlock the door. Just as the flight attendant was about to open it, the turbulence stopped, and she heard me desperately yelling, "Someone's in here! Stop opening the door!" Finally, she stopped trying to unlock it. I finished up and got out, trying to put on the show I had downloaded. Unfortunately, it wasn't working. In fact, the only music or show that was downloaded to my phone and would work was the World War Z soundtrack, to drown out the baby's incessant screaming. By this point, it was 3 hours of constant noise, which was impressive but incredibly annoying. I played it at full volume in my headphones and finally fell asleep. When we landed, I tried to go to the bathroom again because I still had diarrhea. At this moment, my mom decided it was the perfect time to stop me and try to have a conversation. I couldn't talk because of the strep throat and because I had to scream, "Someone's in here," repeatedly. So, I tried to text her to communicate that I couldn't speak, and she was getting frustrated, saying, "Just say it. Stop being dramatic," unaware that I couldn't talk at all. I also had to clench my buttocks harder than Nacho Libre to avoid an embarrassing situation outside an airport bathroom. It was the worst plane experience ever. Story 35. I have a few experiences to share. Amsterdam to Montreal with KLM. The plane accelerated for takeoff but suddenly braked. You could hear the tires screeching. Then, it returned to the gate, and we had to wait for a few hours to get the plane replaced. They never offered an explanation. I suspect it was a near miss, as just seconds after the plane stopped on the tarmac, we saw another plane landing to our left, crossing our path just meters in front of us. If we had continued our takeoff, there would surely have been a collision. Birmingham to Gdansk with Ryanair. The entire plane was filled with Polish families going home for a long weekend. There were at least 30 babies under 4 years old. It was a flying kindergarten, overflowing with toys, screams, and crying. Warsaw to Paris with Air France. The weather in Paris was horrible, with rain and crosswinds causing the plane to sway in all directions. The landing maneuver was attempted twice. I had never been so scared of a crash during landing. Story 36. Severe barotrauma. During my first flight, I had no idea my ears would pop as we climbed but wouldn't equalize during landing. My eardrums were being pulled inward, and the pain was excruciating. Tears rolled down my face. I perforated one eardrum and was deaf in the other ear for half a day. Now, when I fly, I use nasal irrigation for at least 2 weeks prior to departure. I apply heat packs to manage the pain and use various techniques to equalize during descent. Depending on the airport, my experience varies. I can't fly into Brisbane without perforating my eardrum. I've done it 3 times and won't do it again. Story 37. Flying to Japan in 1982, I was 12 years old. Mom bought me headphones so I could spend the next 5 hours engrossed in a double feature film on Golden Pond and Chariots of Fire. What a perfect experience for a 12-year-old. Story 38. I was 17 on a 3-hour flight. The guy next to me looked to be about my age. We were fine the first hour, but in the second hour, he just touched himself over his pants. It was gross and weird, and I did not know what to do. I ignored it and pretended it wasn't happening. That was more than a decade ago, and I still get the creeps thinking about it. Story 39. The man next to me on a long flight had poor hygiene. He kept placing his hands on his armpits and rubbing himself frequently. However, that wasn't even the worst part. Before landing, he stood up to go to the bathroom, and his pants fell down, exposing his bare backside. It was the worst experience I have ever had. Story 40. Being sandwiched between 2 overweight individuals, my shoulders were pinned to the seat by their arms. Luckily, it was only a 2-hour flight from Kansas City to Minneapolis. Story 41. Flying on a red-eye flight from Los Angeles to Australia takes about 16 hours. We take off. Everyone gets settled in. The lights dim, and I'm prepared for a poor night's sleep. However, a baby starts wailing 3 rows ahead. I think, no big deal. The mom will settle the child, and we'll all be fine. But that doesn't happen. I watch as the mother puts on her headphones and reclines her seat. The baby calms for a bit, but like clockwork, starts crying again every 15 to 20 minutes. At the time, I was working as a nanny, so I would startle awake, checking to see if the mother was doing anything. Her only action was feeding the baby once. When we began to land, the flight attendant actually had to shake her awake. We finally arrived at our hotel and ended up crashing that day instead of starting our exploration. Story 42. It wasn't on a plane, but in an airport. I was pulled aside for a bag inspection by police in Germany. I have no clue if it was random because I had no reason to be questioned, and my carry-on just had generic items like a book, headphones, and an extra sweatshirt. I was surrounded by 4 police officers who were shouting instructions at me in German. I don't speak German. They quickly realized I had no idea what they were saying and that I was not the person they were looking for. They politely sent me on my way in English, but I thought I was about to be locked up for no reason in another country. Story 43. I took a red-eye flight from California to Newark. I had an aisle seat right behind first class. When I boarded the plane, someone was sitting in my seat, clearly part of a family of 6. A mother, a father, and 4 children under 6. They were dressed in Middle Eastern clothing. I spoke to the flight attendant, and she assigned me a new seat 2 rows back, in the middle. I put up a small argument, but they were busy getting everyone on board. I decided to let it go since I just wanted to sleep. During the flight, 2 of the children were screaming and crying loudly without stopping. The mother was doing her best to calm them down, but it didn't seem to help. The father just sat there and did nothing. Story 44. My 25-year-old son had food poisoning just before our flight home and spent 3.5 hours throwing up and passing out repeatedly on the plane. I finally convinced the attendants to let him sit in the bathroom while I waited outside the door until we landed. I kept opening the door to hand him a new bag every so often. Poor kid. Additionally, while all this was happening, a crawfish got loose and scurried up the center aisle. Only a few people noticed it before my other son saw it, caught it, and took it to the same attendant to handle. No panic ensued. Story 45. Having an upset stomach on a turbulent flight from Boston to Los Angeles was quite the experience. I had to inform the other passengers waiting for the restroom that it was an emergency 3 times. Then there was an adult behind me, just crying and asking the flight attendant to tell the pilot to take it easy. By the way, don't eat at the Dunkin' Donuts in Boston Logan Airport. Story 46. I was having stomach issues and had to use the bathroom. I took a small bottle of travel deodorant with me for a few quick sprays to spare those sitting close by from the aftereffects. As I was finishing up, I heard loud knocking. I said, "I'll be out in a minute." But then there was banging and then incredibly hard banging as if someone was trying to break the bathroom door down. What was going on? I opened the door to an irate flight attendant screaming at me, "Were you smoking? Were you smoking in there?" Over and over, right up in my face. I calmly looked at him and said, "Do you smell smoke? Do you smell any smoke?" "No, of course you don't." Because I wasn't smoking. He had smelled the deodorant spray and assumed I was trying to cover up smoking. Story 47. I watched a child, around 7 or 8 years old, consume an entire large bag of nacho cheese Doritos in about 10 minutes. I thought to myself, that seems like too many Doritos for a child. The next thing I knew, there was bright orange vomit everywhere. Smelled bad and looked worse. If the flight attendant responsible for cleanup had been armed, I'm not sure if she would have shot him or herself. Story 48. Well, there was a fire in the bathroom that was accidentally set off by a discreet smoker. It was less than 10 minutes into the flight, so we had to turn around and land where we took off. Story 49. I was experiencing irritability and was seated next to a screaming baby. I took Ativan until I stopped worrying about my reaction to the situation. I took too much Ativan. My mom picked me up and found me barely conscious in a wheelchair. I don't recall my sister's wedding the next day, but I was apparently acting normal. My anxiety about my sister's wedding likely prevented me from having seizures after coming off the high dose of Ativan, as I took at least one the next day. Story 50. We experienced slight turbulence. As a small child, I loved it and had a lot of fun. My mother hit me in the face in front of everyone because I was having fun while she was scared. Story 51. As a teenager, I was very focused on my hairstyle. I brought a small can of aerosol hairspray onto the plane, which was before the events of September 11th. I went into the lavatory mid-flight and gave my hair a spritz. Suddenly, screeching alarms went off. I thought the plane was going down, so I quickly left the lavatory, only to find a flight attendant outside the door who accused me of smoking. I explained that I was just using hairspray. He said that would trigger the alarms. It was really embarrassing. Story 52. Red eye from New York to Hong Kong on Cathay Pacific. For some strange reason, the flight had several newborn Chinese babies on board. Strangely, they were all taken care of by what seemed to be their elderly grandparents. It was a harrowing flight, as at least one baby was wailing throughout. Luckily, I got an upgrade to business class on the next leg to Singapore. Story 53. It's a tie between 1. Dropping several hundred feet due to an air pocket. A 14-hour flight stuck next to a 7-foot-tall, 400-pound passenger. Story 54. Aerosinusitis is the worst pain I've ever experienced. Causes sharp pain in your face, usually during descent. Typically occurs when I have a cold and am flying. Using earplugs, chewing gum, and nasal spray helps a lot to prevent it. Story 55. I was on the way back from Japan. On my flight, there was a child crying in the back and a severely autistic child 5 rows ahead of me. The child would cry, and then the other child would start singing Old MacDonald Had a Farm. They took turns making noises. It was so disruptive that the flight attendants had to pass out earplugs and apologize to us. It was a 9-hour flight, and I couldn't catch a single minute of sleep. Additionally, 2 people sitting next to me in the other aisle started discussing cryptocurrency. I was miserable and fell asleep on the drive home. Story 56. 2 parents are trying to calm their children down with sugary treats, but the kids are becoming increasingly energetic. They are not just crying. They are screaming at the top of their lungs. The more sugar they get, the wilder they become. Story 57. Nothing crazy, but I was flying solo and was seated next to a lady and her husband. She was in the aisle seat I had reserved, so I kindly let her know she was in my seat. She hesitantly moved, but both she and her husband were clearly bothered. The flight was okay. The husband took my armrest, but that was it. When we landed, I stayed seated, waiting for the 15 rows in front of us to deplane row by row. They were mumbling about me not getting up, which made no sense because everyone was simply sitting, waiting for the closer rows to exit until it was our turn. When it was finally time for our row to get up, the husband stood up quickly and tried to step over me into the aisle without letting me up first. I got up quickly and kind of beat him to it. He made some sort of rude comment about how I should get off the plane faster. They just seemed like a miserable couple. Story 58. I was quite young and had never experienced motion sickness, but when we landed, I felt extremely nauseous and vomited onto the seat in front of me and all over my lap and shirt. I'm just glad that was our last stop for the day of travel so I could go change. Story 59. Sitting next to an overweight person with babies and toddlers in close proximity creating chaos, and the person next to you vomiting, the list goes on. Story 60. The worst experience I had was sitting next to an overweight man. I was pushed against the window. I weigh only 110 pounds, and he was spilling over into my seat. It was the most miserable 13-hour flight from Los Angeles International Airport to Seoul. Story 61. I have flown a lot in my life. The worst experience was my most recent flight returning from the United Kingdom. We had a layover that arrived late, so we had to take a separate bus to be shuttled near our gate. Even then, we had to go through security and customs again, and we were extremely tight on time. By the time we got through, my husband and I had to run to our gate, which happened to be the last gate in the entire building. I used to run track and cross country, and it felt like we had to run nearly a mile with our luggage just to reach our gate. I had planned to use the restroom and grab some food before boarding, but we didn't have any time. When we arrived, I had shin splints, needed to use the restroom, was hungry, felt nauseated, and had a headache. I remember sitting on the ground in exhaustion and crying. On the flight, there were 3 babies right in front of us, screaming on and off, giving me a splitting headache. I realized I had left my painkillers in my checked luggage. I felt too nauseated to ask a flight attendant for pain relief, so I sipped ginger ale instead, which was the worst I have ever had. I managed to eat dinner on the plane but desperately wanted to lay my tray down to rest my head and doze off. Unfortunately, the person in front of me was reclined, so I couldn't. I remember practically leaning on my husband. That entire flight felt like purgatory. In the last hour, I started feeling extremely nauseated. When breakfast was served, I knew if I had anything, I would throw up, so I decided to skip it. I managed to hold myself together long enough to get off the plane and go into the closest restroom to be sick. Story 62. Last week, my plane almost crashed, similar to the Korean Jeju airplane incident. We were about to arrive at our destination, Jeju Island, so the plane began descending. We flew through clouds, and visibility was limited to white outside the windows. I thought we were still a few hundred meters above ground level, but suddenly we broke through the clouds, and the runway was just a few meters below. What I had mistaken for clouds turned out to be fog. We landed with a force that felt intense, and the airplane was traveling at full speed. It took some time, what felt like minutes, but eventually it came to a stop. I knew I was not the only one thinking these might be my last few seconds on planet Earth. Story 63. We encountered turbulence over the Italian Alps. The terrain was very jagged, and the plane felt like it was dropping 30 feet at a time. It was quite scary. I experienced bad turbulence recently, but the pilot warned us it was going to happen, so I didn't think it was a big deal. Last year, I boarded a plane with a terrible migraine. What made it worse was that I was boarding in New Orleans, a city where loud music plays everywhere, even in the airport. I was also surrounded by people playing their own music without headphones, children with loud tablets, and individuals having loud conversations. I was on a local flight in India where the person behind me used my armrest for their bare feet. It was unpleasant. Airline seats are becoming unreasonably narrow. Every coach flight I take feels like torture. My butt and hips fit in the seat just fine, and I can buckle up without issue. However, my shoulders are wider than the seat. While I have broad shoulders, I am not some kind of circus freak that prompts comments about grotesquely large shoulders. There is no reason for the seats to be narrower than my shoulders. I once sat next to a very large individual and had to sit at a 30-degree angle the whole time. My back was killing me afterward. Story 64. I had to sit behind someone who thought it was acceptable to go shoeless during the flight. He also placed his feet on the armrest, and at one point his toes touched me. Story 65. I found out the hard way that a child in a baby seat needs to sit by the window. Southwest Airlines said nothing until we taxied to the runway. Then the flight attendant noticed that the child was sitting between my wife and me. They actually pulled the plane over, and we had to move the baby seat to the window, which delayed the entire flight. From then on, I always checked the baby seat and used a harness, and I never flew with Southwest Airlines again. Additionally, United Airlines had a serious incident. An engine failed just as we were preparing for takeoff. Luckily, we weren't airborne yet, and everyone was fine. I was stuck overseas for an extra day, but I do sometimes still fly with United Airlines. Story 66. I was 8 months pregnant, traveling with my husband and toddler. Our connecting flight was delayed 3 hours out of Chicago. I received a giant coffee stain on my white shirt. We boarded the plane, but it was grounded on the tarmac in St. Louis due to a severe storm that had grounded all flights. We were on the tarmac for 6 hours with no water or snacks, except for a box of raisins that another passenger found in her purse. A cranky flight attendant announced she was off duty and let down her ponytail. I got into an argument with her because she told me I couldn't use the restroom. I, the huge, hungry pregnant lady, told her she couldn't tell me what to do since she was off duty, and I brushed her aside. Other passengers were yelling at her too. Our plane finally took off because we had live organs on ice that needed to reach their destination, and we experienced horrible turbulence that made me wonder if I would go into labor. Teens with their parents in front of us were screaming that they were going to die. We landed back in Chicago instead of San Francisco, and there were no flights out. I had to beg the airline to provide us with a hotel since the airport was full of stranded passengers. Our luggage was lost. I had to turn my underwear inside out and continue wearing the large white shirt with the big stain on the front, like a billboard. I landed in Oakland instead of San Francisco and took an expensive cab home. My toddler handled everything like a champ. There was absolutely no news about the horrible storm that disrupted flights nationwide. My luggage arrived the next day while I was being transported to the hospital to give birth. Story 67. When I was a child, I often spilled my soda on whoever was unfortunate enough to be sitting next to me, sometimes even strangers. It was not my worst experience, but it might have been theirs. Story 68. I had a red-eye flight the morning after a show, so I had been up all night and still a bit intoxicated. The passenger next to me was perfectly groomed, wearing a spotless white dress shirt. He obviously took pride in his sharp appearance. I tried hard to stay awake because every time I fell asleep, I would snore loudly. Even worse, I would pass gas loudly. I could tell by his expression that he was not happy about the situation. Sorry, man. Story 69. We flew to Ireland, and there was a group of guys in their 20s who had been visiting Toronto. I don't think they had showered since they left the Emerald Isle, and they were sitting all around us. They say you can become nose blind, but we didn't. Story 70. I was on a 4-engine plane. One of the engines failed. The pilot announced we would be 15 minutes late to our destination. Then another engine failed, and the pilot announced we would be 45 minutes late. Unfortunately, the third engine failed as well. The pilot announced we would be 1 hour and 30 minutes late. I had a connecting flight and was getting really worried. Finally, the last engine failed. We were 3 hours late, and I missed my connecting flight. Story 71. I was a child, but I remember many back-to-back inconveniences in one day. My parents and I were on a flight from Florida, and we were supposed to get home by mid-afternoon. There were already delays due to approaching thunderstorms, but the plane took off and was able to avoid them for a while. 2 rows behind me, a man complained of severe abdominal pain, and we had to make an emergency landing in Washington, D.C. Since the storms were severe at that point, we did not take off again until they passed. We got home at 5 a.m. Story 72. Coming home from Florida to Pennsylvania in February, there was a snow and ice storm in Pennsylvania, but as passengers, we didn't really know. It was night, and with the clouds, we couldn't see anything. We knew we were approaching for a landing, but had no perspective on how far we were from the ground. Suddenly, the plane pulled up sharply. Then we climbed and circled back in, and the pilot pulled up hard again. Finally, the pilot announced that the weather was impacting the landing and that he would attempt it again. He successfully landed the plane. I was a teenager with my dad. Story 73. A solo traveler is stuck in the middle seat next to a man with his legs crossed, the dirty soles of his shoes touching my legs. I didn't prepare offline downloads for Netflix because the flight had an entertainment unit, but it was broken, resulting in hours of boredom. Story 74. Sitting at the gate for 3 hours while the pilot kept saying, just another 10 to 15 minutes. After 3 hours, we deboarded. The flight was only supposed to be a little over an hour. They said they fixed the issue, so we reboarded, but before takeoff, the pilots informed us that they had reached their maximum allowed working hours, and we had to deboard again while they found a different crew. After waiting another hour, we reboarded with the new crew, prepared for takeoff, only to have it aborted due to too much ice on the wings. A 1-hour layover turned into 14. The worst part was sitting for 3 hours while the pilot kept saying, 10 more minutes. Story 75. There was a 2.5-hour delay at the gate after we all boarded. This also happened to be the same flight where I lost my passport at the security checkpoint and left it behind. Story 76. Definitely the toothache I experienced while flying from San Diego to Houston in 2020 was quite distressing. I believe the altitude and pressure caused a recent filling to become painful. It didn't help that the flight lasted nearly 3.5 hours, and I had no painkillers. I love flying, but I was never happier to be back on solid ground, and the toothache went away just like that. Long story short, after one root canal, I thankfully had no more issues. Story 77. Someone experienced severe diarrhea all over the bathroom. The flight attendant dressed in hazmat gear and spread used coffee grounds as part of their training. It helped, but the situation was still quite unpleasant. I was in the last row of business class, and this incident occurred right behind my seat. Story 78. A man sitting directly in front of me smoked for 4 hours almost non-stop, while the air conditioning blew the smoke straight at my seat. Story 79. I was on a Yeti Airlines flight in 2008 in Nepal. There was tape holding certain panels in place, such as the overhead bins and mask compartments. Halfway through the flight, we lost power in one of the two propeller engines. Oil poured out and ran across the windows, but we landed safely. Story 80. I have experienced some really rough bouts of turbulence, but those aren't my worst experiences. In 2010, I flew to Italy to tour Europe with my sister, who had been studying abroad. My flight out of O'Hare was delayed by 2 to 3 hours when I finally landed, due to the Iceland volcano. At that time, they wouldn't let you check in at the counter until a specific amount of time before your flight, so I had to retrieve all my belongings and check in again at their international terminal. I sat there for about an hour before I could even make it through security. As I was going through security, someone mentioned that the only substantial food in the terminal was McDonald's, which I could no longer access because it was before security. My flight was then delayed another 3.5 hours after hitting a flock of seagulls and damaging the nose cone while landing. I had a few bags of chips and random snacks from the vending machine for dinner while sitting at the gate with many restless teenagers. The nose cone was replaced, and we boarded the plane without any further issues. The meal on the plane was terrible. Despite being an Italian airline, Alitalia served questionable meat covered in a sauce with what I am pretty sure was gnocchi. There were also no individual TV screens, so the only entertainment was whatever poor quality movie they played. The people sitting next to me were rude and looked at me as if I were a homeless person because it was my first trip abroad. Thankfully, we landed safely in Rome, and I was thrilled to get off that plane. I am also glad Alitalia no longer exists because that was worse than flying with Ryanair. Story 81. Rerouted from our arrival location as we were approaching due to a tornado on the ground to a city 4 hours away. We were on the ground there for a long time before we went to a gate. It was unclear if we were going to take off and go to the original destination or what was going to happen. I reached a point where I felt I could not stay on that plane any longer, so I deboarded, rented a car, and drove the 4 hours home. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.